The first thing David Carter noticed when he came back from his morning run wasn't the cool autumn air clinging to his skin or the faint smell of pine carried from the woods. It was the paper. A single sheet, flapping against his front door like a taunt. Red block letters stamped across the top, notice of violation. David froze. He had seen plenty of these in his neighborhood. The HOA liked to police everything from grass height to mailbox paint, but this one was different. It wasn't about his lawn, or his truck parked on the curb, or the flagpole flying the American flag he had served under for 20 years. This was about his family. He tore the paper down and read the words carefully. His wife's flower garden, small, neat, and carefully kept, was unauthorized landscaping. The penalty? A daily fine, plus the threat of further enforcement actions, up to and including eviction proceedings. David's jaw tightened. His wife, Angela, had spent hours every weekend tending that garden. Roses, daisies, marigolds, all blooming in a riot of color that softened their modest home. It wasn't just a garden. It was her peace. And now the HOA wanted it gone. Angela came to the door, her hands still dirt-stained from planting. "What's wrong?" she asked, seeing the storm brewing in his eyes. David handed her the notice. She read it once, then again, her lips trembling. "They can't do this," she whispered. "We followed every rule, David. I even checked the bylaws." "They think they can," he said grimly. He folded the notice in half, then in half again, until it was just a crumpled square in his fist. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." Angela touched his arm. "Please. Don't go to war with them." Her words hung in the air, but they couldn't smother the heat rising in his chest. War was all David had ever known. 20 years as a Navy SEAL, Somalia, Fallujah, Kandahar. He had fought men who thought fear was a weapon. Compared to them, a smug HOA president with a clipboard didn't scare him. But what unsettled him was the precision. This wasn't just some random complaint. It was targeted. That evening, David sat at the dining table, flipping through the HOA rulebook. Angela cooked quietly in the kitchen, her shoulders tight with worry. The house felt smaller, the air heavy. On every page, David saw vague language and loopholes. The kind of rules that gave power to whoever enforced them. The HOA president, Evelyn Hargrove, wasn't subtle about her dislike for them. She was a polished woman in her 50s, always dressed like she was attending a country club luncheon. She smiled when she wanted something but wielded fines like knives when she didn't. Angela had once overheard her say at a neighborhood barbecue, "Some people just don't fit the image we want here." David hadn't forgotten. By nightfall, another notice came, slipped under their door this time. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten. "Remove the garden, or we remove you." Angela gasped when she saw it. "This isn't legal, David. This is harassment." David stared at the note, then at his wife. He thought about her hands, blistered from tending the roses. He thought about the years he'd spent protecting his team, his country, his home. And now, here in this quiet neighborhood, someone dared to threaten the one thing he loved most. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. "Angela," he said quietly, "pack up the kids and take them to your sister's for the weekend." Her eyes widened. "Why? What are you going to do?" David looked at the note again, the handwriting jagged with arrogance. His pulse was steady now, the same calm before the storm he had felt countless times overseas. "I'm going to remind them," he said, "that I didn't survive all those years in uniform just to be bullied in my own home." He walked into the garage, flicked on the light, and pulled open a dusty trunk. Inside were mementos of another life, a folded flag, a row of medals, a knife with his name etched on the blade. And at the very bottom, a leather-bound book filled with names and numbers. Men he hadn't spoken to in years. Men who had sworn an oath alongside him. Men who owed him nothing, yet would come if he called. David ran a finger over the first name. He could almost hear the voice, deep and steady, "Brother, you just say the word." He closed the book with a snap. The HOA thought they could scare him into silence. They had no idea they'd just awakened the wrong man. The next morning, the neighborhood looked as it always did, manicured lawns glistening with dew, sprinklers ticking in rhythm, the hum of garage doors opening as neighbors set off for work. To an outsider, it was the picture of suburban peace. But David Carter saw through the facade. Every smile from a neighbor felt strained, every nod a silent calculation. He had lived through ambushes in desert villages where quiet streets hid deadly intentions. And now, standing on his porch in a small Virginia neighborhood, he felt the same chill prickling down his spine. The HOA wanted him gone. Angela had left with the kids at dawn, her car loaded with bags. David had kissed her forehead, promising everything would be fine. But as her taillights faded, he knew that fine wasn't enough. This was war. By noon, he was sitting in the local diner, a mug of black coffee cooling in front of him. He flipped open the leather-bound book. The first name stared back at him, Marcus "Hawk" Hawkins. Sniper. Calm, calculating, deadly when he needed to be. David pulled out his phone, tapped the number, and pressed call. It rang once. Twice. Then a familiar voice. "Brother." David exhaled. "It's been a long time, Hawk. Too long. What's going on? I need you." There was silence on the line. Hawk didn't ask for details. He never did. Finally, he said, "Where do I meet you?" David smiled grimly. "Home." By evening, the first sign of retaliation had already arrived. David found his truck keyed across the side, a deep gouge cutting through the paint like a scar. On the windshield, another note. "You don't belong here." He stood in the driveway, fists clenched, as neighbors peeked through blinds. Some looked away quickly, unwilling to be caught watching. But one didn't, Evelyn Hargrove. She stood across the street, dressed in her usual tailored blazer, arms crossed, pearls gleaming at her throat. She smiled. David walked across the street slowly, like a predator closing the distance. Evelyn didn't flinch. "Problems, Mr. Carter?" she asked sweetly. "Not yet," he said. "But keep pushing, and you'll find out what a real problem looks like." Her smile widened. "You think your military background intimidates me? This isn't a battlefield. This is my neighborhood. My rules. People like you should remember that." David leaned closer, his voice a low growl. "I don't forget rules, Evelyn. But I also don't forget enemies. And you just made yourself one." Her eyes flickered for the briefest moment before she turned away. But David saw it, the first crack in her armor. That night, headlights swept across his driveway. A black SUV pulled up, engine rumbling low. The door opened, and out stepped Hawk. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes sharp as glass. He looked around once, then clapped David on the shoulder. "Damn, brother. Place looks nice. Except for the war zone on your truck." David allowed himself a small laugh. "You haven't changed." "Neither have you," Hawk said. Then, more seriously, "Tell me everything." Inside, over whiskey and the smell of old leather, David explained everything, the notices, the threats, Evelyn's smug smile. Hawk listened, expression unreadable. When David finished, Hawk leaned back. "Sounds like they think they can push you out. Fear and intimidation. Same tactics we saw overseas, just dressed in suits and HOA bylaws." David nodded. "That's why I called you. This isn't just about fines or a garden. It's about sending a message. They want me to bow. I won't." Hawk's lips curved into a slow smile. "Then let's make them regret underestimating you." The next day, David and Hawk began their watch. They weren't reckless. Years of training had taught them patience. They observed. They noted license plates, routines, the comings and goings of Evelyn's little HOA enforcers. And soon, they saw the pattern. 3 men, always together, always in Evelyn's orbit. One with a clipboard, one snapping photos of minor violations, the third a hulking brute who lingered too long near Angela's flowers. They weren't just volunteers. They were enforcers. Late one evening, as the sun bled red across the rooftops, David caught them on his security cameras. The men had stepped onto his property, ripping Angela's roses from the soil, laughing as they crushed petals under their boots. David's blood went cold. He didn't rush outside. He didn't shout. Instead, he turned to Hawk. "It's time." Midnight fell heavy over the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, save for the distant hum of cicadas. David and Hawk moved like shadows, their boots soundless against the pavement. They weren't armed with rifles or grenades, this wasn't that kind of war. But in their hands, flashlights, cameras, and the kind of tactical precision that came from years of silent missions. They followed one of Evelyn's enforcers to his home, a 2-story with a manicured lawn. The man slipped inside, smug and unguarded. David and Hawk circled the property, snapping photos, the illegally extended fence, the unregistered trailer parked behind the house, the unauthorized shed built too close to the neighbor's lot line. By dawn, they had a dossier. At breakfast, David slid the folder onto Evelyn's porch. No words, no threats. Just photos, violations, proof. By afternoon, Evelyn was storming across the street, face flushed with fury. "You think this is a game?" she hissed. David met her gaze, calm as a coiled spring. "No, Evelyn. I think this is war. And I never lose." Her lips tightened, but she didn't speak. She turned and walked away, heels clicking sharp against the pavement. For the first time, David saw something new in her stride. Not confidence. Fear. But the war had only just begun. Because that night, as David and Hawk sat in the living room planning their next move, a brick shattered through the window, landing on the floor with a note tied around it. David unwrapped it slowly, his jaw clenched. "Leave now. Or next time, it won't be a warning." Hawk picked up the brick, his face hardening. They just escalated. David looked out the broken window, the night pressing against the glass. Somewhere out there, Evelyn and her enforcers thought they were in control. He poured himself another drink, his voice steady as steel. "Then so do we." The brick still lay on the living room floor the next morning, surrounded by shards of glass that caught the sunlight like frozen fire. David hadn't cleaned it up. He wanted the sight to burn into his mind, a reminder of the line that had just been crossed. Angela's voice echoed in his memory, "Please, don't go to war with them." But the war was already here. Hawk walked in from the kitchen, holding a steaming mug of coffee. "They're escalating, brother. We've seen this play before. They want you scared. They want you reactive." David nodded slowly, staring out the broken window. "They think I'll crack. They've got no idea who they're playing with." He pulled out the leather-bound book again. His fingers brushed over another name. Luis Tank Ramirez. Heavy gunner. Loyal, fierce, unshakable. David dialed the number. It rang once. Twice. Then, "Carter. That you?" David smiled for the first time in days. "Yeah, Tank. I need you." Tank didn't hesitate. "Where and when?" "Now. My place." By evening, Tank's Harley rumbled into the driveway. The man was built like a fortress, broad chest, tattooed arms, eyes that missed nothing. He stepped off the bike, grinned, and pulled David into a crushing hug. "Hell, brother. You call, I come." HOA smashing. Hawk chuckled from the porch. Welcome to suburbia. The battlefield's changed, but the fight hasn't. Tank looked around at the neat houses, the trimmed hedges, the kids riding bikes down the street. He raised an eyebrow. This the enemy? David handed him the brick with the note still tied around it. Tank's smile vanished. All right. Now it's war. The three men set up that night. Hawk installed extra security cameras, discreetly hidden in gutters and trees. Tank reinforced the doors and windows, muttering, feels like Fallujah all over again. David compiled a list of every HOA bylaw Evelyn and her crew had ever violated. But it wasn't just defense. They were planning offense. Fear cuts both ways, David said, his voice low. They want to play dirty. Fine. We'll show them what dirty looks like. Hawk leaned over the table, tracing a finger across the neighborhood map. Evelyn's house is the command center. Her enforcers follow her lead. Break her control, the rest crumble. Tank cracked his knuckles. So we make her feel what you've been feeling. Pressure. Fear. Doubt. The first strike came 2 nights later. Evelyn woke to find her pristine white picket fence covered in bright red stickers, each one marked with HOA violation. The irony was brutal, her fence was 2 inches taller than bylaws allowed. The photos David and Hawk had taken were already copied, slipped into mailboxes up and down the street. By noon, whispers spread like wildfire. Neighbors pointed, murmured, shook their heads. Evelyn's smile was gone, replaced with tight lips and darting eyes. David watched from his porch, arms crossed. Tank sat on the steps polishing his bike, grinning like a wolf. She's cracking, Hawk muttered. But Evelyn wasn't beaten yet. That evening, as David grilled steaks in the backyard, headlights flared across the fence. 3 figures climbed out of a black SUV, the same enforcers who had destroyed Angela's roses. They moved with a swagger that made David's blood boil. Tank was already on his feet. Want me to handle this? Not yet, David said. He walked calmly to the fence, spatula still in hand. The tallest enforcer, a heavy-set man with a shaved head, smirked. You think you're clever, Carter? Spreading lies about Evelyn. That's harassment. David leaned on the fence, voice steady. Funny. You didn't think it was harassment when you trespassed on my property. Or when you threw a brick through my window. The man's smirk faltered. David took a step closer. Here's the thing about intimidation. You'd better make damn sure the guy you're trying to scare isn't someone who's lived through worse than you can imagine. The silence stretched. Then Tank stepped forward, cracking his knuckles loud enough to echo. Hawk appeared at David's shoulder, eyes cold as stone. 3 against 3. The enforcers faltered. The shaved-head man muttered something under his breath, then turned back toward the SUV. The others followed, slamming doors as they sped off. Tank chuckled. Didn't even have to throw a punch. Not yet, David said. His voice was calm, but inside, the storm was building. That night, retaliation came again. David's security cameras caught 2 figures creeping up to his front porch, spray cans in hand. But before the paint touched the siding, floodlights blazed on. Hawk's voice boomed from the shadows. Smile for the cameras. The men froze like deer. Tank stepped out from behind a tree, towering over them. The cans clattered to the ground. Without a word, the intruders bolted into the night. By morning, David had emailed the footage to every neighbor. He didn't add captions or threats, just raw proof of who Evelyn sent to do her dirty work. The neighborhood's whispers turned louder. Neighbors weren't just gossiping anymore. They were asking questions. Evelyn's perfect grip on the community was slipping. But cracks in her power only made her more dangerous. Late that afternoon, David returned from a supply run to find Angela's car back in the driveway. His heart dropped. She hadn't called, hadn't texted. Inside, he found her in the kitchen, pale and trembling. "Angela," he said, rushing to her. "What are you doing here? You weren't supposed to come back yet." Her hands shook as she held out a folded letter. "They followed me, David. To my sister's. They left this on her porch." David unfolded the paper. The words punched him in the gut. "You can't hide them forever. Next time, we won't miss." Hawk and Tank read over his shoulder, their faces hardening. "They've crossed the line," Hawk said. Tank growled, slamming his fist against the table. "Enough games. We take the fight straight to them." David's jaw clenched. His wife, his kids, dragged into the line of fire. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a declaration. He looked at his brothers, his voice steady and lethal. "Then it's time we remind Evelyn and her lapdogs what war really looks like." The house was silent, but David could feel the tension pressing against the walls like a storm waiting to break. Angela sat on the couch, clutching the letter as if it might burn her fingers. Hawk stood near the window, scanning the street, every muscle sharp with readiness. Tank paced like a caged animal, muttering curses under his breath. David set the letter on the table. The bold, threatening words stared back at him. "Next time, we won't miss." His voice was calm, but inside it felt like steel being forged in fire. "They want to threaten my family," he said quietly. "Fine. Let's show them what it means to go too far." Hawk turned, eyes narrowed. "You're ready to escalate." "I don't have a choice anymore," David replied. "This isn't just about fines, gardens, or trucks. They brought my wife and kids into it. They followed them. That ends now." Tank cracked his knuckles. "So what's the play?" David leaned over the table, spreading out the neighborhood map. "We stop reacting. From this point forward, we dictate the fight. Evelyn thinks she controls this neighborhood. Tonight, we tear that illusion apart." The first strike came under the cover of darkness. While most of the neighborhood slept, David, Hawk, and Tank moved like ghosts. Their mission wasn't sabotage or violence, they didn't need that. Their weapon was exposure. At Evelyn's house, Hawk crouched by the curb, snapping photos of her SUV parked illegally halfway across a neighbor's property line. Tank took pictures of the unapproved extension built onto her deck. David captured the overflowing trash cans, left out for days against HOA rules Evelyn herself had written. By 2 a.m., they had enough to bury her reputation. But David wasn't satisfied. "Evidence is one thing," he whispered. "Fear is another." So Tank left a small package on her doorstep, a thick folder filled with her own violations, sealed with a single note on top. "Nobody is above the rules. Not even you." The next morning, Evelyn's scream echoed through the neighborhood. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, neighbors peeked out. They saw Evelyn on her porch, clutching the folder, her face pale, her hands shaking. By noon, copies of her violations were slipped into every mailbox on the street. The whispers turned into open talk. "If she's breaking the rules, why should we listen to her?" one neighbor muttered at the diner. Another shook her head. "She fined me for my lawn gnomes, while she's been cheating the system herself." The seeds of rebellion had been planted. But Evelyn wasn't one to surrender quietly. That evening, David and his brothers watched from the porch as the black SUV returned. The three enforcers climbed out, but this time their faces weren't smug. They were tight, grim, uncertain. Evelyn stood behind them, her pearl necklace catching the dying light. She called across the street. "Mr. Carter. We need to talk." David stepped off his porch, his brothers flanking him like sentinels. The air between them felt electric, thick with years of training, discipline, and unspoken power. "You've made your point," Evelyn said tightly. "You've embarrassed me in front of this community. But you don't understand, this neighborhood runs on order. On control. If people see weakness, everything falls apart. David stopped a few feet from her. Control isn't the same as respect. And weakness isn't what your neighbors are seeing. They're seeing the truth. Her eyes burned with fury. You think you've won? You think exposing a few violations will stop me? I built this HOA. I decide who belongs here. And you, Mr. Carter, do not belong. David's voice was low, calm, dangerous. You've underestimated me since day one. You thought I was just another homeowner you could bully. But you made one mistake, Evelyn. Her lip curled. And what's that? David's eyes narrowed. You forgot I don't fight alone. On cue, Hawk held up his phone. A live feed played across the screen, neighbors gathering on David's lawn, dozens of them, whispering, pointing, watching Evelyn. The videos of her enforcers vandalizing property, the photos of her violations, David had shared them in the community group chat. And the people had seen enough. By nightfall, the neighborhood was buzzing. Small groups stood on corners, talking loudly. Words like corruption, abuse, and resignation floated through the air. For the first time, Evelyn's control was slipping through her fingers. But fear made her reckless. At 3 a.m., David woke to the sound of tires screeching. He rushed to the window and saw flames licking up from his mailbox. Tank was already outside with a fire extinguisher, dousing the blaze. Hawk pulled a pistol from under his jacket, scanning the dark street. David's jaw clenched. They're done playing games. Tank wiped sweat from his forehead. So are we. The next day, David called an emergency neighborhood meeting. Not through the HOA, but on his own front lawn. One by one, neighbors arrived. Some nervous, some angry, some simply curious. Angela stood at David's side, her hand trembling in his, but her eyes steady. Hawk and Tank flanked the edges of the crowd, silent guardians. David stepped forward. Many of you know what's been happening, he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. You've seen the notices, the threats, the intimidation. You've seen the rules bent to break people, not protect them. My family was targeted. My home was vandalized. My wife and children were threatened. And I know many of you have faced the same. The crowd shifted, voices rising in agreement. He held up the folder of evidence. Evelyn and her enforcers have been breaking the very rules they use to punish us. They claim this neighborhood is about order. But what they really want is control. Fear. Power. His voice hardened. I didn't spend 20 years fighting for freedom overseas just to come home and see tyranny in my own backyard. This ends now. Cheers erupted from the crowd, neighbors nodding, some even clapping. But as the noise swelled, David saw Evelyn standing at the edge of the street, her face pale, her fists clenched. The enforcers were beside her, but for the first time, they looked uncertain, their loyalty wavering. Hawk leaned close to David. She's cornered. Desperate. That makes her dangerous. David nodded slowly. Then we finish this, before she takes it further. That night, Evelyn made her boldest move yet. David woke to a crash, glass shattering downstairs. He leapt from bed, grabbing the baseball bat he kept by the nightstand. Hawk and Tank were already moving, trained instincts snapping into place. They stormed down the stairs. In the kitchen, the back door hung open, the curtain fluttering in the night breeze. And on the counter, in the glow of the moonlight, sat a single object. A photograph. Angela, standing in her garden. The kids playing beside her. A red X scrawled across their faces. David's breath caught. Hawk swore under his breath. Tank's hands curled into fists. This isn't just harassment anymore, Hawk said. His voice was deadly calm. This is war. David stared at the photo, his pulse steady, his eyes cold. Then tomorrow, he whispered, we bring the fight to her doorstep. The photo sat on the counter like a curse. The red X across Angela and the children's faces seared itself into David's mind. He had fought warlords, insurgents, and terrorists, but never had rage burned in him like this. They marked my family, David said, his voice low and dangerous. That's the last mistake they'll ever make. Hawk and Tank exchanged a glance. Hawk's expression was tight, calculating. Tank looked ready to tear through walls. Tomorrow, Hawk said, we go loud. At sunrise, David was already on his porch. Angela stood beside him, pale but steady, her hand gripping his arm. David, promise me, no matter what happens, you come back inside to me. He kissed her forehead gently. Always. By mid-morning, the plan was set. Hawk monitored the neighborhood's chatter online, seeing how Evelyn was trying to spin the story. Tank loaded evidence packets into envelopes, every violation, every recorded threat, every photo of Evelyn's enforcers caught red-handed. David prepared a speech not for Evelyn, but for the community she had poisoned. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. At noon sharp, David, Hawk, and Tank walked across the street to Evelyn's house. Neighbors peeked from windows, whispers rippling like wind. The three men didn't hurry. They moved with the calm of soldiers walking into a battlefield they'd already decided to win. Evelyn was waiting on her porch, flanked by her three enforcers. She wore her pearls, her blazer, her painted smile, but her eyes betrayed her. They flicked nervously from one man to the next. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice icy, you're trespassing. David held up the thick envelope. No. I'm delivering. She frowned. Delivering what? Your resignation. Gasps rippled through the small crowd gathering on the sidewalks. Evelyn's smile faltered. Excuse me. David's voice carried, calm but sharp. For weeks, you've terrorized my family. You've sent your enforcers to vandalize my property, to follow my wife, to threaten my children. Last night, you left a picture on my counter, a threat so vile I can't even repeat it in front of these people. But here's the truth, Evelyn, your time is over. He handed the envelope to the nearest neighbor, who opened it and gasped. Inside were photos of Evelyn's SUV illegally parked, her deck extension, her fence, her overflowing trash, all violations. More envelopes circulated, each one filled with proof of corruption, vandalism, and abuse. This, David continued, is the evidence of every law you've broken. And every crime you've committed. I've already sent copies to the county sheriff, to the HOA oversight committee, and to a lawyer who specializes in housing abuse cases. By tonight, the authorities will be here. And when they arrive, it won't be me they're asking questions about. The crowd buzzed louder, voices rising with anger and disbelief. Evelyn's enforcers shifted uneasily. One of them muttered, she told us it was legal. Evelyn snapped at him, her composure cracking. Shut up. But the damage was done. The crowd turned. Enough of this. Evelyn screamed, her face red. I built this community. Without me, it falls apart. You need me. No, a neighbor shouted back. We don't need a tyrant. Yeah, another added. You fined me for my garden lights while you built an illegal deck. You tried to evict us for nothing, someone else yelled. The tide had shifted. For years, Evelyn's power had rested on silence and fear. But fear only works until someone stands up. And David had stood. Now, the whole neighborhood was standing with him. Evelyn's eyes darted, wild and desperate. You think you've won, Carter? You think this little stunt changes anything? David stepped closer, his presence towering, calm, immovable. This isn't a stunt. This is justice. And you're finished. She trembled. For the first time since he'd met her, David saw it, pure fear. And then, in her panic, she made her final mistake. She lunged for the folder in a neighbor's hands, clawing at the papers. The sudden movement startled the crowd. One of her enforcers tried to grab it too, but Tank stepped forward like a wall, blocking him with a single shove that sent the man stumbling backward. Hawk snapped photos with his phone, documenting everything. "Assault," Hawk muttered. "That's the nail in her coffin." The crowd erupted, shouts echoing down the street. Evelyn's enforcers backed away, suddenly aware they were outnumbered. Neighbors surged forward, not violent, but united. For the first time, Evelyn looked small. Sirens wailed in the distance. Evelyn's face drained of color. She turned to David, her voice cracking. "Please, we can make a deal." David shook his head. "I don't make deals with bullies." Moments later, 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled onto the street. Deputies stepped out, confusion turning to resolve as David handed them the compiled evidence. Neighbors stepped forward too, each sharing stories of intimidation, fines, harassment. Evelyn tried to protest, but the officers silenced her. Within minutes, she was escorted into the cruiser, her pearls glinting in the sun as the door shut. The enforcers, too, were questioned, their confidence shattered. The neighborhood was silent as the cars drove away. Then, slowly, applause began. One neighbor. Then another. Until the entire block was clapping, cheering, voices rising like a victory song. Angela stepped forward, tears in her eyes, and wrapped her arms around David. "It's over," she whispered. David kissed her hair, holding her close. "No," he said softly. "It's just beginning." That evening, the community gathered again, this time on David's lawn. They voted unanimously to dissolve Evelyn's leadership and appoint an interim committee until a fair election could be held. For the first time, people smiled freely, without fear of fines or notices taped to their doors. Tank raised a beer. "To freedom from HOA tyranny." Hawk smirked. "To Carter, who turned a neighborhood into a battlefield, and won." David chuckled, shaking his head. "To all of us. We did this together." He looked around at his brothers, his neighbors, his family. For the first time since moving into this house, it felt like home. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, David Carter, the man the HOA had tried to break, stood tall, unbroken, with his community finally standing beside him.